one of the things that I was sort of taking away from, as you were both speaking on this subject of transition, was number one, transitions are messy, right?
For sure.
Right? There's no getting away from the fact that, you know, there's never going to be a clear-cut, straight line sort of path. It's going to be, no, they are messy. And one of the things that I took away, in addition to sort of messy transitions, and if we're working on the basis that, you know, transitions are going to be messy, is that when you talk about the military and the difference between how the military behave in Southeast Asia and when you look at the Middle East and North Africa, what I took away is that it's the role of what the military see themselves as. And so, if the military sees themselves as someone who is not only protector of the people, but also ideology, that's where then you kind of get a little bit of shaky ground. Is that fair to say?
Let me respond first and throw it back to Tess, if I may.
Go on.
Yeah.
No, change is always uncertainty. It's always messy, and I want Tess to go further into that in a sense. And the reason I need to add something about Tess's biography, which is I've watched military coups, revolts, what have you, all my life across the globe as an observer. An observer on the ground, but nonetheless as an observer. Tess actually has practical experience. She was part of the overthrow of Marcos. And she was part of the first post-Marcos cabinet with 7 failed counter-coups attempts. So she speaks about this in a much more from first personal and real experience rather than me who watches other people get killed, basically. But coming back to the military for a second, I think it's a function of 2 things. It's a function of how the military defines its role, and also how the military defines its interests. And where the split in the military, if a split in the military occurs, it's not so much on what it defines its role as, in terms of whether it's the defense of the country's borders, or whether it's a defense of a political system or an ideology. The split occurs on what serves best the military's interests. So Marcos, or the military leadership, as opposed to the faction that was led by Ramos in the Philippines, would not have differed on what their role was. But they differed on what, in that specific political environment, the military's interests were. Whether that, and those interests can be varied. They can be political, they can be a combination of issues. But I think that that's where it's more the interests than the definition of role. But again, Tess can speak to that out of experience.
Right. Okay, well, the Philippine military in the 1980s, just before the 1987 uprising, was a very factionalized military. It was told that around Marcos there was one general who was his cousin, and they came from the same region up north, the Ilocos region. And General Fabian Ver, his name, had access to a lot of the prerogatives of the executive branch, which meant that a large part of the military had been sidelined. President Ramos, while also being close, because he was defense minister under Marcos, had been sidelined. But apart from that, he was a professional soldier. He had gone to the United States. He graduated from the Annapolis Military Academy, as far as I recall. And he was interested not only so much as in serving the regime, but also in professionalizing the military ranks. And alongside with him were a large number of soldiers who served with him and who espoused the same orientation, the same professional orientation. So in other words, the military saw, the faction that was more professional saw themselves as not only protecting the regime that had become increasingly centralized and personalized under Marcos, but protecting the ideals of a society, and the military as the professional arm that would guarantee this. And this is what started the roots of the cleavage within the military itself. And you saw the same thing happening in Indonesia. Around Suharto, a group of cronies, the oligarchy, and there's military protectors had emerged, which sidelined the professional faction of the military that was led by Bambang Yudhoyono, who later on became president of Indonesia. And a very interesting story is that during the democratic transition of Indonesia, which happened about 10 years later when Bambang Yudhoyono ran for political office, it was Fidel Ramos, who was by then ex-president, who served as his advisor. And I had been in a plane once to Jakarta from Manila, where one of Fidel Ramos's advisors was invited to come to Indonesia to help them in the transition. So these are, if you like, transnational relationships between and among militaries in these countries who are undergoing political transitions. And I think that's one lesson that comes out in our book very clearly, that despite, or even if civil society is considered the handmaiden of political transitions, a political transition cannot take place successfully without at least the participation of a faction within the military. Now, it's not only the military that is essential, of course, or civil society. It has to be also in combination with the business sector, with NGOs, with the media. But the role of the military here, I think, is highlighted very well in this book because it has been largely understudied, but they remain, in our argument, a very crucial partner in any political transition that takes place. Now, again, reflecting on the changes that happened in Malaysia and is still happening, it would be interesting to look at the role of Malaysian military. And I would argue that the forthcoming transition that Thailand is about to undertake in the elections in February 2019, if it takes place at all, is going to be, I think, in large part, the handiwork of the Thai military, who may or may not decide to give up certain prerogatives and certain powers.
What advice would you give based on your extensive experience, based on what you found, of countries that are going through transition? What would you advise them? If those top 3 tips.
Well, facetiously, look anywhere but not the Middle East and North Africa.
Okay, no, bad example.
Look, I think there are various issues. I mean, part of the problem that you have with revolts, and you saw that very strongly, for example, in Egypt, which is if you're revolting against a leader, and that's what you focus on. Your goal at that very moment is the toppling of the regime. You may have ideas about what you want the world post-regime to look like, but you really have not thought through how you're going to go about it. And you also have a dilemma. And the dilemma is you're on the street. You have the momentum. At which point do you surrender that momentum to enter into a political process? Because once you surrender that momentum, getting it back is going to be very difficult, if not impossible. And
so talking of the process, sorry, something that just...
But Tess may have something to add to that.
Yeah. Well, you talked about 3 tips.
Yeah.
You have 1 left.
I have 2.
Okay, go for it.
I would have 2, especially with regards to the military. Number 1 is civil society. Yeah, as I said, it's always at the forefront, but they need to take the role of the military seriously. And in the Philippine context, we did see this happen. One of the things that is remarkable about the Philippine transition is that friends of mine who were in the streets in 1986 did enter government. They ran for elections, they joined the executive branch, some of them became ministers. And they did work with the military closely, even if some of them were imprisoned by the military. I mean, I remembered one of my very close friends who was imprisoned in the 1980s was appointed as the commissioner for the Bureau of Customs. And side by side, he was sitting with a former military person who was appointed, and this guy was the guy who arrested him and tortured him. And he said to us over dinner, this was 1987, the amount of anger and pride he had to swallow to run this Bureau of Customs alongside his former torturer was very, very tough. But he thought of the gains of a new government and preserving those gains, and decided every single day that he will have to make this work, and he will have to work with his torturer, the guy who imprisoned him. But that was not easy, and it was a struggle. The second is that in working with the military, the civilians need to teach them about how to live a civilian life. And a few of them did enter government. The most famous one is Gringo Honasan, who was in the military and led the military coup against Marcos with the defense minister. And he ran for senator. And a lot of our friends in civil society worked with him in the Senate to help run his office and become a civilian legislator. Now again, that's a little tough, you know, if you're if you believe in civilian democracy and you are mentoring a former military guy who did not stop, by the way, to mount several coups against Corazon Aquino, and then later on saw that this was futile and decided, okay, I'll run for office. These are very difficult compromises to make, but to make a society succeed in that transition, it almost comes down to, you know, very personal choices that one makes in order to facilitate a larger social political project. I've had students in my institute in Manila when I was there, faculty, who were former military officers who, a few of them, I can remember about 2 or 3, who took part in these military coups. And they were my students. And what do? Well, you use your position, as I did as a teacher, to train them in the art and practice of civilian democratic management. And by and large, these have paid off. And they pay off after many years. In one particular case, a student of mine who gave up mounting military coups against the government and returned to the classroom in the last government of President Noynoy Aquino, the son of Corazon Aquino, was appointed the commissioner of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. And he said, trying to collect taxes is far more difficult than mounting a military coup. Military coup is easy. You gather a few soldiers and then you mount a few arms and that's it. In 48 hours, it's over. Either you succeed or you don't. Collecting taxes, that's a different story. Because you're running after people who don't pay taxes and you don't know who they are. Or even if you know who they are, there's a long process, a long judicial process that you need to go through. But to abide by the civilian norms of democratic governance is a long, tortuous, painful task. And I think one of the lessons about democratic transition is precisely this. Going out into the streets and protesting is easy. Building a society and a political system, that's the most difficult part. And that's one of the things that we emphasize in this book, especially towards the conclusion.
Starts with you. You're saying as individual citizens, it's going to require both citizens and the military to work together.
Sure.
In order for you to make that healthy transition.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. Where does balance fit into all of this in terms of balancing values, mindset, and how you collectively come together to make this transition?
Well, I think the values that come from civil society, and here there is a bahasa word. I think it's called masyarakat sipil, the guaranteed realm of freedom from state interference. This is the realm of of civil society, of the private life, that decides to engage itself into public life. And this is the norm or the value that continues to guide a lot of civil society organizations until today, even in a context of populism and nationalism. And it's a tough environment, especially in the Philippines, to ensure that that space, that realm of private life that continues to insert itself in the public realm and to preserve that from state interference is going to have to be enforced again and again. I mean, we see a lot of our civil society friends, for example, go the other way and are now espousing authoritarianism after 30 years. That's painful to watch. But I think it comes back to what is that original set of values and mindsets and orientation that you talked about. A firm belief in the values of democratic governance and in the role of civil society cannot and should not be eroded, no matter how difficult the context is. Because if that goes, then we see what happens in a lot of countries in the world.
Would you say transition has a cycle?
Let me come back to the balance question just for a second,
Okay.
if I may.
Yeah, no, of course you can.
And that is, if you've, in the immediate period, whatever, the first, I'm not talking about weeks, but years post-transition, you don't have common values. That's a long-term prospect. What you have is a balance of power and interests. And it's going to be that balance of power and interest that's going to determine how you move forward. It's not going to be common values. I mean, that's a generation down the line, basically. I think that's one. Sorry, what was your question?
So I was asking, does transition have a cycle?
The answer is in my mind. Yes and no.
Okay.
So, with other words, if you look historically at cycles of transition, they're anywhere from a quarter to half a century. So, if that is true, then we're just at the beginning, for example, in the Middle East and North Africa. And we're maybe just past the halfway point in Southeast Asia, at least in the Philippines and Indonesia, less so in Myanmar.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at that cycle, if you wish, or that period that transition takes, it's not a straight line.
Yeah.
It is leaning 2 steps forwards, 1 step backwards,
Yeah.
and maybe at times 2 steps backwards and 1 step forwards. So in that sense, you do have a cycle, and we are in both regions in the middle of that cycle. We're at different stages of the cycle, but we're in the middle of that cycle.
Yeah. In the book, we call it the switch on, switch off democracy.
Okay.
And they switched it off in 2011 and 2016, and they're about to switch it on again, maybe in 2019. We'll see. I mean, Thailand is an interesting story. Malaysia was the biggest story this past year. And I'm not sure if it's a cycle as such, but I think this corresponds to this political scientist, Thomas Carothers. He said transition is not linear, it's not a straight line. Many times you see a regression, and we see that in Thailand. Myanmar, maybe, also, is experiencing a political regression of sorts. And it's, before we wrote this book, the Rohingya crisis had not erupted. Myanmar is proving to be the outlier here. I mean, we said in this book, there's no violence that is comparable to what is happening in the Middle East. Well, maybe not. Maybe Myanmar is very comparable. Okay, so there have been instances where democratic transition has been relatively successful, and I emphasize relatively successful in Southeast Asia, because what we're seeing in Southeast Asia today is not the same as Southeast Asia 2 years ago. The kinds of transitions that are happening today may look like these are regressive democracies, although Malaysia is a darn good example of debunking that thesis. And then we'll see what happens to Indonesia in May next year.
April.
So you have, or April, so you have these very interesting events that are happening in Southeast Asia today that are in a way not conforming to the template, but are yielding very interesting outcomes, and we don't know where they are going to go. As I said, Malaysia was the big story a year ago. We'll see what happens to Thailand in February and possibly Indonesia in April. And we are going to have midterm elections in the Philippines in May. And so you are going to see a region in the next few months, in the first half of 2019, that is again going to be in transition, and we don't know where that is going to lead to. So maybe the sequel to the book is going to be written shortly.